Hi there, everybody. How we doing? Feeling good? Full bellies? My heart is full. It is always good to be back down here with all of y'all. My name is Remy DeCausemaker, and I'm joined by my colleague, Melissa Eggleston. Melissa's actually local to this neck of the woods, so if there's open source folks who haven't met her, definitely want to connect you folks up. This talk is open source and the digital service at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS.gov. So just so folks know you're in the right place. The slides are available on GitHub. That's the link. I will also be posting the link at the end of the talk so that folks can download it. One of the speakers in the earlier session said that you can decide whether or not you want to download the slides after we've given the talk. No pressure. So a little overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to sort of describe the digital service on sort of how we got here and what we do. We're going to talk about open source in general because this is a conference full of introductory members, and maybe our folks online, it might be their first time hearing about it. We're going to talk about how open source, sort of what the vibe is like at CMS today, as well as like policies and projects. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the aspirational future of open source, and as well as ways for folks to get involved in the future. So, like I said, I'm Remy DeCausemaker. I'm the newly minted open source lead at the digital service at CMS. And I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Melissa Eggleston, who is the user experience researcher with the digital service at CMS and the United States Digital Service. And I would like to invite her up now to talk a little bit about our history and what we do. I guess after I give my little intro, right? Okay, cool. So, story time. It was maybe 2014, I want to say. This is not my first time at All Things Open. We're having the 10-year anniversary this year, and this is one of my favorite conferences of the year, period. I think that it's a very unique space. The way that All Things Open is open to lots of different parts of the open source community, not just the technical and the coding. Back in the day, there was actually a government track. And in 2014, I saw a talk that was given by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And they put up their open source story and their journey. And they had like this legal-sized paper where they printed out a subway map of their journey of how they became an open source organization and how they released their code. And we get to meet the upstream developers and talk with them. And I took that thing home and like stuck it on the wall in my bedroom. And I was like, yeah, government doing open source, this is going to be big, right? And I was a nerd for this kind of stuff, doing community organizing and being a civic hacker in a former life as an undergrad. So All Things Open is really a special place in my heart because that's when, you know, programs like 18F and the United States Digital Service and, you know, some of the other great efforts that are doing open source now in the modern era, they were getting a lot of shine and exposure here at All Things Open. So as part of my journey, finding my way here is through talk that I saw in this very building. And that was a while ago now, 2014, I think. So not quite 10 years ago, but close. So that's sort of why I'm here at All Things Open, is to help keep that tradition alive of sharing the stuff that we're doing in the public sector. And now I want to invite up Melissa to give her story too.
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here with you all. Thanks for showing up. I am a user experience designer and researcher. I spend a lot of time with developers trying to make things that people actually want to use, that are actually of high quality. And I am not a person who's been in the government a long time at all. So I'm about at a year and a half. So what I had done is I worked at a sports tech startup in Durham called Teamworks for a couple years. I'd done consulting for many years. I worked at Lenovo. And I tried all these different things. And I noticed right around 2014, 2015 that I had friends who kept joining this thing called 18F. And I was like, what is that? I didn't even know what civic tech was. And I didn't go explore it then. I just was like kind of watching what was going on. And over time I've seen more and more of my colleagues go work in civic tech. And so I got really excited when Joe and Kamala took office in January of 2020. And that is what actually led me to be like, I'll just put in an application and see what happens. And here I am at the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare now. And working in the government has been a really unique experience, not having done it at all before. It's interesting to understand how the government looks behind the curtain, you know, and like you look behind and you go, oh, and then you're like, ooh, like, we gotta do some work here. There's a lot of work to be done. It kind of depends where you land in the government, what projects you're working on. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of like what we're up to at Centers for Medicaid and Medicare. Our job is really to transform the U.S. healthcare system, right? So we have people in charge who talk to us about we've got to make this better, and it takes time, but we're slowly working on various pieces of it, and so we can deliver more value, modernize systems so that they are secure and safe and can be changed quickly. And we're also participating in policy development, making sure there is open source policy in government, that sort of thing. So some of you may not be familiar with Medicaid or Medicare if we have people who are international, or if it's never really been on your radar before. So Medicare, right, is covering our seniors. It's giving them health care. And then Medicaid is covering people who are low income, for example, or who are on disability. So some of our most vulnerable communities are highly dependent on this kind of care, which we definitely want to give people care because we don't want people to get super sick. We don't want people to end up in hospitals because they just didn't get the care they needed to begin with, right? So it took me a while to kind of understand how big CMS really was, and a colleague of mine explained it to me. He said, so the Federal Reserve, who people follow on the news, right, changes the interest rates, and everybody reacts to it. The home market reacts to it. The stock market freaks out. Mortgages start to change, that sort of thing. And CMS does that in the healthcare system because it's such a big player that when it says, nope, we're going to cap drug rates, you know, you can't overcharge all the seniors, you know, or they say, we're going to pay this much for this service, it has ripple effects in the market. And then there's other things that CMS does that's really important too. I mean, I don't know if any of you have seen the Theranos documentary, but the regulators who came in and stopped the nonsense and stopped the dangerous misdiagnosing of blood samples was CMS. Like, they were the people that the whistleblower reached out to. And so there's a lot of different things that CMS is into and doing, and we're the digital folks who are trying to help. We are a team of about 20 or so right now. We work in small groups. We're trying to find what are the things that can make a difference in the organization to help people. These are multidisciplinary teams. So I'm a researcher, I'm working with designers, I'm working with developers. It's kind of I would say it's very flat in the sense it's not very hierarchical, and we're kind of self-organizing. You know, we find out that there's a need. For example, we did a lot of work around the launch of 988, which is our suicide prevention hotline, changed from a 10-digit number, because I don't know how you would remember a 10-digit number if you were actually suicidal. It's now a 3-digit number. It's 988. It's what people should use for a mental health crisis, or they should use if they're feeling suicidal. We helped work behind the scenes to make sure that the infrastructure was there, the calls were being answered, and that sort of thing when it went live in July. So that was like an example of one of the projects we've done. And we're growing. And what we've realized is we need more and more people to be coming into the world of civic tech, and there's lots of different entry points that we'll talk about later. Our team is remote, so you don't have to be in Washington, D.C. anymore to serve your country at the federal level, which is super cool. So we've got teammates in California, we've got people up in Minnesota. I was just there doing research 2 weeks ago, and you know, we kind of skew towards the Northeast right now, but we really need more Southerners, I think, in my opinion. And these are a lot of the people that we're serving through the Center for Medicaid Medicare. It's just a lot of people, a lot of users, a lot of people that we want to have a good experience, whether they're calling on the phone or they're interacting with a piece of digital tech. And we're not only serving the end user, but we're also serving the providers and people who are providing the services. So these are the states who actually implement the funds. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Remy, to talk a little bit more about open source.
Thank you, Melissa. So this might be a review for some of the folks in the audience. We are at All Things Open, which sort of implies that you are either interested or aware of open source. So let's set a baseline. What is open source software? Pretty simply, it's source code that anyone can inspect, modify, enhance, and share. That's the idea. The more people we have looking at problems, the faster we're going to find the solutions and innovate and create new tech and work together better. So open source is not just this like monolithic, there's a community. Open source is a community of communities. And when you think about it in the government context, it's sort of like a nested doll situation where at the center of the communities that I work with as the open source lead at CMS, that's internal. We have our own GitHub, we have our own projects, but we live within the Department of Health and Human Services, which is a cabinet level agency. And then there are a number of cabinet level agencies across the federal government. So that's sort of another layer of the open source community. And then there's that boundary between the internal world of federal government and the external public world. So each of those layers have their own communities, their own projects, their own cultures, their own infrastructure. And open source is sort of a common thread that ties them all together. So being more intentional about how we get people to work together inside and outside the government, that's why I'm there. And the good news is that I'm not the first one over the wall. We already had a pre-existing open source policy inside of CMS. And when people ask like, well, what is the government? What's in it for the government? Why open source? Cost reduction, timelier delivery, improvement of capabilities. These are all the stated official government reasons for, what are the benefits. Specifically, it helps offer considerable savings and greater efficiency because we can repurpose existing software instead of repurchasing it over and over again to solve the same problems. We help to minimize vendor lock-in and have flexibility in the choice of the solutions that we have. It enables transparency because we can, implement extensions and plugins and, build a more robust version of software rather than just being stuck with the one that you paid for on the sticker. It helps to increase productivity because open standards help to achieve interoperability across systems, not just at the federal level, but with the states as well. And supporting open collaboration and innovation and exchanging with the development community means there's a free exchange of ideas. So we can work across lots of different people. Even though the federal government is the largest employer in America, it's still not all of America. So and the world for that matter. So we want to exchange ideas beyond those boundaries of just the nested circles. And this helps to keep us abreast of technology developments and facilitates early adoption of emerging technology. A lot of the stuff you're hearing about at ATO, those are the kinds of technologies that, we want to work with more in the government as well. And there's a lot of myths out there, right? Open source is less secure, it's bad for for-profit companies, it means that all your data's got to be public, it's something the government doesn't already do, and those are all myths. Open source can be more secure. There's an old saying, many eyes make any bug shallow. And that's the idea that the more people you have looking at a project, the faster we can get to identifying problems and create solutions. Security through obscurity didn't work at Helm's Deep, it didn't work for the Death Star, and it's not going to work in the government either. Open source is actually great for business. Here we are, the hometown of Red Hat. They know about the open source business model, and they make plenty of money. I don't need to, there's probably some Red Hatters in the audience today. But, Google, Apple, Microsoft, they're all sponsoring this conference because open source, there's plenty of money in it, and it's great for for-profit businesses because it lowers the barrier to entry and costs of acquisition of software, and it lets you get access to world-class industry-leading tools and infrastructure used at the largest companies all over the world. And open source is not a binary, it's a spectrum. When you're more intentional about what you share and what things you don't share for privacy and security purposes, you can come up with faster, more efficient processes to focus on the places where you can make a difference and protect the things where you need to protect. So being intentional is an important part of opening your data and opening your code. And lastly, by default, federal employees are shipping code in the public domain unless there is a security or contract or other reason for it. Publicly funded work, whether it's research or code, belongs to the taxpayers, right? You paid for this, so you should have access to it. We all should. And we all should benefit and work off of common platforms. So yeah, default to open. So if those are the myths, then what are the actual risks of open source? There's sort of three categories that keep me awake at night. I know yesterday was Halloween, so these are like the monsters under my bed. Over-differentiation, proliferation, and fragmentation. So over-differentiation is when you unnecessarily duplicate your work or unnecessarily divide your resources. So examples of that include things like not invented here syndrome. Proliferation is when you unnecessarily duplicate communities and projects and divide your addressable market. So things like license proliferation, event proliferation, it's where you have lots of options to choose from. But even outside of having lots of options to choose from, fragmentation is when you unnecessarily divide your community. So things like hostile forks or internal forks are creating sort of lots of variations. How many people here have an internal fork of an upstream project inside their company? How many people think that's an easy and fun way to do open source? No hands. Wow, surprising. It turns out that internal forks are extremely costly, and it means that you're dividing at least in half the number of people who are working on things. When you ship upstream, when you make sure that you don't proliferate across non-standard licenses, and when you don't reinvent the wheel all the time, you are doing open source in a way that helps to align your resources and unite your community and build in a common way. And these are the risks that I hope that we can address more with an intentional program. So, where are we at today? Well, how do we do it? Well, there's sort of three different categories. We got policies about how we inbound and outbound code and content. We have open source projects that are publicly available, github.com/CMS.gov, among other places. And also programs on how we onboard new contributors and get people into internships and hire and do all kinds of things with the open source community. So there are over 150 million people that depend on the code that we steward at CMS. There are hundreds of source code repositories with thousands of contributors and millions of lines of code. So it's a big community, even just within CMS. And we're not the only ones. You know, there have been over 20 years of federal open source policy, almost 30 actually, if you go, well, in some cases. But back in 1999 was the first time that, you know, the high-end computing and making the business case for open source documents were published. And back in 2000, SE Linux was released. I still use SE Linux for access-based control and security on my distro, right? So that was a collaboration between the public sector and the academics in 2000. 2003, the Department of Defense started publishing their guidance on using open source software. In 2009, the Obama administration appointed the first CIO and CTO of the United States, so having technology leaders at that level, and also released a memo about clarifying their guidance on open source software. 2011, we came out with the Open Government Action Plan. 2014, which I already sort of alluded to, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau published their open source policy. The next versions of the Open Government Plan came out around that same time, and then places like 18F and USDS and GSA.gov all released their open source policies, and we all have sort of been building on each other's best practices throughout that entire era. So 20 years of story of the open source world. My colleague Alberto Colon Vieira actually does a whole internal seminar series about the history of these policies. This is like a whole hour talk by itself, and I just put it in one like pithy timeline, but like, thank you Alberto for helping to share that history. So inside of CMS, some of our biggest open source projects are actually APIs. We have Blue Button, which is for getting people's claims data to them. There's beneficiary claims data API, the data at the point of care API, and then the AB2D, which helps connect Medicare Part A and Part B and D all together. So A is hospitals, B is, great, B is something else, and D is drugs. So yeah, I'm pretty new if you can't tell. I've been there for about 4 months. Hopefully the folks on the live stream maybe will comment with what B actually is. Maybe like one is inpatient and outpatient or something like that. That sounds right. So inpatient, outpatient, and drugs. So the idea is that there are a variety of ways of getting at this data. A lot of this data lives in like pretty gigantic, somewhat legacy mainframes, right? So getting that data out to providers who want to do pricing information and do care, citizens and users who want to get access to their claims data and provide it to like third parties. One of our biggest sort of wins in recent memory with Blue Button is that it connects up to like the Apple Care, right? So you can get at your medical and health information inside of your phone, which is going to hopefully unlock a lot of interesting innovation within the community. And you can see sort of a timeline of in the past sort of 4 years where these focuses have happened. We moved to the 2.0 Blue Button API, which used to be like a giant PDF download of all of your records, and that's not super machine readable or very developer friendly. So now there's actually a standards-based API that returns text and has endpoints. We released sort of interoperability and patient access rules to talk about like how to get this data over APIs. We have final rules about the prescription drug plans. We have data at the point of care, which is a good way for like doctors, I believe, to share data amongst each other when they're having different patients working in common. We launched our claims data API. We finalized the interoperability and patient access rules, prior authorization rules, and now updating to the latest FHIR R4 standards for all of these APIs. FHIR is the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Records something or other API, right? So FHIR is a standard. You can check it out. hl7.org is the upstream open standards organization that stewards that. And it is an open standard that helps all of our stuff sort of speak the same language and work together across different use cases. So the idea is that with these APIs and with some of these projects, we're transforming healthcare by helping recipients, by helping providers, helping accountable care organizations and other folks that are experimenting with new value-based models of supporting and reimbursing healthcare and saving money, and insurance plans, which, are a big piece of the puzzle too. So the big picture is we have open source software and you combine it with open standards and you get something that looks like interoperable systems that can talk with each other, enable innovation, and create an ecosystem where people can work together to solve some of the hardest problems facing public health today. And we got policies for this stuff. This is a lot of text, so I'm not going to read it all. But more or less, when we're thinking about how we inbound or take open source code and bring it and make it a part of our systems, we're thinking about sort of what are the existing alternatives that are commercial and off the shelf? What is the maturity of the project? What's their market share? How credible are they? Do they have docs? Is there a community? Is it active? Is the code quality good? How fast are they making releases? Is there a process for bugs and vulnerability tracking? And looking at the costs and risks and things like, how well will it integrate with our existing environment? Will we need to customize it a lot? Is there a talent pool with a lot of people that we can hire or contract with to help us work on this? Is there some prohibition of a federal security policy or other policy that prevents us from implementing this thing? Are there professional services available like third-party vendor support to help us configure, integrate, or operate? And then, what's the cost of using and maintaining it versus the cost of acquiring? That's also like the total cost of ownership, not just the initial sticker price, because we know that open source tends to be, free as in price in the beginning. And then lastly, looking at the licensing. So are there any license restrictions or obligations on merging it or including it in the existing code that we have? But open source is two-way. So it's not just what code we're depending on, but what about when we release code? Well, when I walked in, there were these things called recommended policies. So things like providing ample documentation, roadmaps, philosophy, goals, design, decision-making process, how to submit issues and feature requests, and there are recommendations around like using standard practices that we see in the open source world, like mailing lists and message forums and version control and wikis and tracking of the project itself. These are all sort of general recommended practices, right? So really, Some other recommended practices that came in are like distributed and decentralized governance and defining your team and their roles and then staffing those roles so that there's someone there to help do those things, and then identifying ways to promote active contributors to committer status so that they can help with day-to-day operations. And these are all, recommendations, right? But, how do you do that specifically? Well, you do it with a program. Well, that's one way to go about doing it. My background is I've helped to create open source programs in large companies. If you look in the archives of All Things Open, you'll see some talks that I've given about open source program offices at various places. And this model may be able to help us at the federal level as well. It works in the private sector. And there was a great document that came out from the Linux Foundation this year called A Deep Dive into Open Source Program Offices. The URL is on the bottom here. But in that, and we borrowed a lot of graphics in this next portion of the presentation from that report. And I think that this one is a sort of a great general life cycle to talk about how the 4 core stages of open strategy. So you start out as a consumer, maybe you're just using a piece of open source software, and then you find a bug, and you're like, oh, we need to fix this. And somebody says, hey, well, they got a bug tracker, let's submit a ticket. And then maybe after you submit a few tickets, you say, hey, we got somebody over here that actually solved this ticket and has a solve for it. So they might contribute that back upstream. And then you do enough of that, and before you know it, you're leading working groups and going to meetups and helping with mailing list moderation. And then before you know it, you're leading in projects. And that life cycle of, you're not just a passive consumer of software, you're actually an active participant who can help in the production of it, is sort of how you develop through the open source contributor funnel, right? It's not treating your users like customers, but treating your users as potential partners in your journey. And this can apply at the project level or the community level as well. So what are some of the challenges you face? Well, culture is a big one. Everyone knows that large organizations move slowly and have a lot of inertia. There are a lot of processes, and complicated ones at that, for doing things at the nation scale. There are a variety of tools that people use to do this kind of work. How do you sort of have it be continuous in between different elements of stakeholders and people doing the work? And then how do you educate people about it? FEAT. Oh, no worries. We got to help the gamification. FEAT 10 is the gamification code for the featured session here that you're attending today. Hopefully you folks get a chance to win the prize. So of those challenges that we just talked about, this isn't necessarily an exhaustive list of all of the things that you can do to address them, but it's a nice little buffet of a place to get started. So on the education side, things like guidance on policies, new employee orientation, checklists for inbound and outbound code. So when we had those recommended policies, it's not just you should do this thing, but here's a checklist of things you can do specifically to address those things. As well as, helping with procurement, helping people learn about coaching and mentoring. There was great sessions yesterday at the Community Leadership Summit talking about doing this kind of stuff. Professional development for folks who want to get credit and recognition for doing this extra work that sort of goes beyond the standard job description, right? So once you have the education in them, then you can start to have some tools to talk about how to implement the guidelines. You do community architecture analysis, you gather repository metrics, you create linters and templates so that people have a place to start from. You help with inventory management. You help with project management. And once you've got education guides and you've got tools, you need policies around them. So what's our contribution policy, and what do the bug bounty system look like, and how do we do responsible disclosure of vulnerabilities, and do we have a code of conduct, and how do we implement it, and what happens when there's an incident, and who's responsible for that? Once you got your policy, your tools, and your education, you got to talk about it. So maybe you put it into, an internal portal. Maybe you want to share that publicly afterwards. Maybe you want to do some data visualization, perhaps maybe speak at conferences and do public speaking. publishing in papers and journals, as well as holding internal and external mailing lists. And that all helps with continuity. So I'm just one person. That's a single point of failure, right? You don't want one person being responsible for your community. It's a pretty small community if it's a community of one. So how do we do succession planning? How do we distribute governance? How do we automate the manual work that goes into running these programs and making them happen? Because all of this work is done by people, and there's only so many people and there's only so much time. So the idea of continuity and automation and getting involved in growing your base is an important part of helping a community survive and thrive, especially for someone like me who's term limited. We do a tour of duty model. So this is what an aspirational roadmap might look like if you have all those pieces. Start off by hiring a lead. Hi there. You do some metrics gathering. You get some templates. You present at places like this. You start to review policies. You start to talk about what you're going to do internally and communicating up the chain about the types of things that can happen. And you start providing tools, guidelines, best practices. Then you turn those into trainings. You start interviewing for new people. Once those people get there, you do an inventory of the stuff that's all there, get your topology, then maybe talk about what's there, what's the backlog look like, what is the industry, or sort of what does the ecosystem look like inside of your particular community, and then you start recruiting again, and then you talk about it, and then you repeat the cycle. And that's maybe what an open source program might look like. So, how can you get involved? Well, there's sort of three different avenues or channels that we want to talk about today. You've been hearing from me and Melissa. We're with the Digital Service. It's a 4-year tour of duty for established professionals in engineering, product, design, and data science. Start off at GS 13 plus usually. You can look up the government pay scale on the internet. It's public. Salary transparency is good. And CMS.gov/digital-service-CMS if you want to find out more about that program. Another program that we are a huge fan of is the inaugural year for the Digital Core. It's a 2-year tour of duty for early career technologists who can convert to full-time at the end, and they get a 50% recruitment bonus when they sign up, and you have, a full-time job at the end of this. digitalcore.gsa.gov. This is great. There's low-key, Fulbright scholars have joined our team, and amazing people with amazing backgrounds that, it's so inspiring to be working with, people who are motivated and care about not just their career, but their impact on the industry and on the country. And lastly, if you're sort of earlier on in your career than that, Coding It Forward has paid 10-week summer internships for currently enrolled undergrad, grad, or bootcamp students or recent graduates. So codingitforward.com, and all of these programs are an integral part of the staffing strategy that we have at the open source program at the Digital Service. So if you like what you've been reading about or hearing about here, these are 3 different ways that you can get involved. And you don't have to just apply to work full time. Some of these are up to 4-year tours of duty, but every 13 months you get to decide if this is still for you. There's so much work to be done and not enough people to do it. And even if you can't do it full time, you can start by volunteering in places like Code for America and the U.S. Digital Response. So with that, it's a good time to close. Thank you, All Things Open, for taking the time and joining us today. If you have open source questions, open source at cms.hhs.gov. If you want to talk to the Digital Service at CMS. There's the GitHub link for the slide deck if you want it. Patch is welcome. And here's those 3 links again: digitalcore.gsa.gov, codingitforward.com, and CMS.gov/digital-service-CMS if you want to answer the call and help us solve some of the hardest problems in public health. We need all the help we can get. Thank you. I think we've got time for questions if anybody would like to ask, and I'll invite Melissa back up here.
I would also say that we're happy to answer questions about working in government in general, because there's now a lot of different places to work in government, and sometimes it's not clear what is this one and what's this one and what's the difference and that sort of thing. So we can answer whatever about open source or that.
Right in the middle. Background check process. So there's the, I went through equip, I think it is. It's a pretty extensive background check. Depending on what agency you land on, there are different levels of clearance. So we're public trust at CMS, so it's not like top secret or anything like that. But I think it was like 7 years of history I had to go back through. Employment, places I lived, references, things like that. Travel, international travel, that was another one that was fun to put together.
Yeah, and it's a little different just depending on where you land. So I came in through the U.S. Digital Service. So the FBI came and talked to all my neighbors, which was embarrassing because I didn't know, and I just moved to my neighborhood, so they were like, what is going on? And it took about, I would say, 3 months to go through the process. So kind of like after I'd gone through interviewing a few times and they'd made me the offer, then I just sat and waited for a few months for this thing to go through. So it was a lot of detail. I gave them a lot of names of people I'd known. They didn't contact any of those people. They contacted people who knew those people and tried to get at me in different ways, and I was able to get through. But it does take a lot of time, and it's just part of the hiring process, is to just challenge the government.
I did not have the FBI come and talk to all my neighbors, so it really depends on which way you come in through.
Yeah. Where your entry point is, yeah.
Other questions? Do you want to go first?
You go first.
So the question was, can we talk a little bit more about the technology stacks that are used? Without being like too, tongue-in-cheek about it, like more or less all of them, right? Like it really depends on where in the government you are. The Medicare and Medicaid data sets are like still very dependent on like mainframes from the 1960s that run COBOL, right? So like if you're a COBOL hacker, shout out, please come talk to us because like we need you, and there are not enough people teaching that in university programs anymore. So if you know any COBOL folks, let us know. But that's, not everybody, right? We use modern stacks like React. We use modern frameworks like Drupal. We use Python. We use lots of open source technology. It all depends on sort of where you are at the agency and what the projects are. And as digital service experts, like we get to sort of bring that to the table. We sort of get, in a very like product-y way, requirements come to us and they say, we want a website that does X, Y, or Z. And then folks like Melissa, who are user experience researchers, are like, great, let's talk to the users first, figure out what they need, and then they pass that to engineers who are like, here are some tools that might make sense. And it's an opportunity for us to help bring things forward into sort of the modern era. So modernization is a big part of what we do. So you have a good bit of freedom, creative freedom to decide. And, my pitch will always be, is it open source? I think that's an important part of it. But depending on what your expertise is and what you bring to the table, that is why we want people from the outside to come in so they can help make those recommendations.
Yeah, I'd also say that I was a little worried when I went into the government. I kind of was like, am I going to go backwards in my career? I just didn't kind of know what to expect. And I actually feel like I've leveled up a lot because the problems are incredibly complex. And oftentimes it's working with a government partner and they lay out their COBOL situation. And then you're trying to figure out how do we get you away from that? How do we get you to a more modern system? How do we do this in a way that isn't going to be completely disruptive? How do we do this in the budget? I mean, it's pretty complicated, but it's meaningful, and it does allow people to bring creativity to what are different strategies we could do this, and let's decide together. And so that's been a really interesting thing to learn and see, and we just need more and more people to move into civic tech to help problem solve, really, and solve some of this stuff so that it can be modern. I worked on a thing for the state of New Jersey where everything was it was an unemployment insurance form, and they couldn't change it because it was written on really old code. They didn't have contracts related to it. So we ended up kind of subverting and going around a little bit in order to solve the problem in the shorter term and saving 24 minutes of time when people are filling out this form, which is a big difference in people's lives, right? So you kind of get to have these impacts and help civil servants who really do care and who are kind of stuck, help them make it better for the people they serve. That's cool.
Other questions? Anybody here looking for work right now? Well, if you are, or you know someone who is, these are the links that you can use to get at our opportunities to join and answer the call of service. Again, you know, short-term, long-term, permanent, whatever way you can contribute or help, we need all the help we can get. So thank you all for listening today. Thank you for contributing to open source. Thank you for being a part of the All Things Open community. Thank you, Melissa, for joining me up here today. She's local. Y'all should get to know her a little bit. She'll be around these parts. My name is Remy DeCausemaker, and it's always a pleasure and an honor to be here at All Things Open. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you again next year.